The trip to the moon would take a few days, but we are going to skip past that to the part where disaster strikes. All right, Apollo 13 is now much closer to the moon than it is to Earth. This would be a very bad time for something to go wrong, which of course is exactly what happened. During a routine maintenance procedure, some wires in the service module short-circuited, causing a fire. This fire built up pressure in one of the oxygen tanks, and that eventually caused an explosion. A whole panel was blown off of the service module, and power and oxygen levels started draining very quickly. The astronauts had to work quickly to shut down the power in the command module to conserve what little power there was left. And they had to transfer over to the lunar module. The lunar module, of course, was only built for 2 astronauts, so it was very cramped in there. And you can see that in this game, it won't even let me put 3 astronauts in there. You can see how tight it is in there. The lunar module thus became a lifeboat for the 3 astronauts. The mission was now no longer landing on the moon, but simply getting back to Earth safely. Now, how is that going to happen? Well, one idea was to simply turn the ship around and blast it back to Earth. That would definitely save time. But there were several problems with that. First, while NASA had come up with a direct abort procedure, which is what this was called, it was not designed to be performed this far away from Earth. Another problem was no one had any idea how much damage the service module's engine had taken. If the astronauts tried to light up this engine and there was damage, the whole thing could have just gone up. So they considered that this engine was no longer able to be used, and they could only use the engine on the lunar module. So, since direct abort was not going to work, NASA opted for a free return trajectory. A free return trajectory basically means that the ship was going to slingshot around the moon using its gravity and set it on a path straight back to Earth. Now, when we set our path to the moon in the first place, we were able to set it on what was already a free return trajectory, so we won't have to make many adjustments, I hope. But we will see. The astronauts certainly would have had to do that. So now that the path is decided on, how are the astronauts going to survive? Remember, this lunar module was designed for 2 men on the moon for, well, not all that long. It now has to support 3 astronauts for several days. So a lot of the power had to be cut off. A lot of the power systems. The astronauts had to ration their water and other supplies, so they weren't getting that much water every day. Heating was definitely off, so it got very cold in the module. And then there was another, actually rather infamous problem that NASA came up with a very interesting solution to, which we'll talk about rather soon here. First, let's warp the ship into the moon's sphere of influence. So one of those interesting problems having to do with keeping the astronauts alive was carbon dioxide filters. Now the LEM, the lunar module, had enough oxygen for all the astronauts. They were able to figure out how that would work. The problem was carbon dioxide. Humans, when they breathe in oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. Now carbon dioxide is toxic to humans. So you don't want that floating around inside a small space like the LEM. So to deal with that problem, both the command module and the lunar module had carbon dioxide filters. The lunar module, unfortunately, was running out of those filters with 3 people breathing the air. The command module had plenty of carbon dioxide filters. The problem was this. The carbon dioxide filters on the command module didn't fit in the slots for the carbon dioxide filters on the LEM. Now, fortunately, some time ago, NASA engineers had realized it might be possible to use the supplies on board these ships to adapt the carbon dioxide filters from one of the modules to the other. But they had never really done it before. So, Mission Control worked feverishly to devise a very strange and new procedure to make the command module filters fit the LEM filter holes. They came up with something they nicknamed the Mailbox, and I will try to link into the description below a video a little bit about how that worked. Suffice it to say, I think it's one of the greatest STEM projects of all time, involving plastic bags and lots of duct tape. But in any event, the Mission Control folks came up with a procedure that the astronauts could use to take the supplies they had and create an adapter for those filters. That problem was solved. Another tense moment happened on every Apollo mission, but was especially tense on Apollo 13, was when it passed the far side of the moon. You'll see there was a green line connecting the ship to Earth. That represents the communications between Mission Control and the Apollo spacecraft. You'll notice on the far side of the moon, that green line has disappeared. Whenever the ship orbited the moon, whenever any Apollo ship orbited the moon, it would lose contact with Mission Control briefly because it was on the far side of the moon, and their communications wouldn't simply go through a giant hunk of rock in space. Especially a tense moment here, because if something had gone, even more had gone wrong in this mission on the far side, Mission Control wouldn't have known about it and wouldn't be able to help the astronauts. Fortunately, that time passed without incident, and communication was reestablished. Let's take a look inside our lunar module here, because the astronauts would have definitely been able to see the moon from here. Let's see if we can get them a nice view before we send them on their way home. There it is. And that was the closest that those astronauts would get to the moon. Re-entry was going to be a challenge for the astronauts as well. On any Apollo mission, you need to make sure that the ship re-enters the atmosphere at the right angle. If it comes in too steep, the heat shield is not even going to be enough to keep the capsule from burning up. But if you come in too shallow, the ship skips off the atmosphere and back into orbit. And by the time it comes back, life support systems are not going to be able to keep the astronauts alive, no matter what Apollo mission you're on. All right. The astronauts are back in the Earth's sphere of influence at this point. I'm looking at our trajectory here. And I think we're coming in a little too steep. So, since I'm on the opposite side of this orbit, to expand my orbit, I'm going to accelerate in the direction that I am traveling. Let's see if I can make this angle of entry a little bit shallower. And we'll fire the engines now. Let's see how that affects our orbit here. Yeah, it's hard to see, but it looks like we're coming in a little... It's expanding, so our angle of entry will be a little shallower, which is what I was hoping. That's enough for now. We won't waste too much more time on that. But the astronauts would be making several course corrections as they came back to Earth. All right, in order to give myself enough time to get through all these procedures, let's start talking about what the astronauts would have to do to get ready to re-enter Earth's atmosphere. First of all, they would need to power on the command module again, which had been completely shut down. Now, the command module was not designed to be powered up from complete shutdown in the middle of space. So on Earth, Mission Control had to devise a new set of procedures to power it up without shorting anything out and completely ruining the electrical power system. But they were able to do that. And then, of course, the astronauts would have to transfer themselves back into the command module. The command module was the only part of the ship that had a heat shield. So, of course, if they were going to survive re-entry, the astronauts would have to be in the command module. Then the astronauts would have to jettison the service module as well. And it was at this point that they actually got their first look at the damage. Let's see if we can get a look at our service module here. There it is. And this was the first time they realized that a giant hole had been blown open in the side of the service module. Additionally, the astronauts also observed some damage to the engine, which justified the earlier decision not to do a direct abort using that engine. Then the astronauts had to get rid of the lunar module, which was unfortunate because it did keep them alive, so I'm sure there was a little emotional attachment. But they would not have survived. They would not have survived the lunar module if it had re-entered. So they had to get rid of that as well. Can you imagine that as an artifact from the space race? The lunar module that kept the astronauts alive. Alas, we must bid it farewell. And now we need to orient our command module so that the heat shield is facing in towards the atmosphere. Here was one final problem to which there was no solution. No one had any idea if the explosion had damaged the heat shield, and there was no way of checking. So once the astronauts were on a path to re-enter Earth's atmosphere, people just had to hope and pray that it would hold. We'll skip ahead here. All right. The Kerbal engineers make good life support systems and strong heat shields, but let's hope this is enough. You can see it heating up now, and the astronauts would have definitely seen this on their way into the atmosphere. See it heating up. You can see the strength of our heat shield here. Now, the astronauts would not have seen that, probably. The other parts of the ship exploding as they re-entered the atmosphere. But that's what would have happened. They would have re-entered the atmosphere, and those parts would have been destroyed. Now, during re-entry, especially during that rather fiery display there was a radio blackout between Mission Control and the Apollo spacecraft. And that was expected, but it lasted for 6.5 minutes. And you can just imagine how tense those 6.5 minutes were when Mission Control had no idea if the astronauts had survived re-entry. But once radio communication was reestablished and the parachutes were opened, everyone knew the astronauts were going to make it back safely. We'll skip ahead here a little bit to splashdown. But that's Apollo 13. A successful failure because it failed in its primary objective to land on the moon, but successful in that Mission Control was able to rewrite the mission to get the astronauts home safely.